Hello, this is Angela with Parker's Permaculture. It's a lovely sunny afternoon here in Portland, Oregon. I'm hanging out in the backyard of my permaculture garden. It's nice to have this little shady pergola here where I can escape the afternoon sunshine and make a video for y'all. So today I want to cover a subject that has been on my mind for a while, and I think it's one that's really important for us to wrap our brains around if we want to push our systems toward resilience. If we want to increase the stability and productivity and health of our system, and if we want to have true sustainability, we need to understand the topic of today's video. So there are going to be a lot of terms that I'm going to be defining for the purpose of this video, because I think it's important for us all to be on the same page with our understanding of the words that I'm going to be using today. So I want to discuss today the concept of stress as stimulus, the concept of disturbance as a positive force. In permaculture, we talk about using the edges and valuing the marginal. That's permaculture principle number 11. And for the purpose of this video today, I want us to think about how there is a sweet spot between rest and trauma, where we get an increased yield, we get an increased productivity, and we get increased resilience in our gardens. So think about in human psychology how we can have stress as a positive force in our life. It can motivate us to do better. It can motivate us to produce more effectively and more efficiently. It can help push us in a direction we wouldn't be able to go ourselves. For example, a deadline at your job can help motivate you. The pressure is on, right, to get your project completed on time, but that's a good kind of pressure. It helps push you to achieve your goals. On the other end of the spectrum, there is, abuse or just straight up trauma. And so what we're talking about here is not sitting around and having complete and total rest. We're not talking about an experience of stress that is traumatic. We're talking about that section in the middle where stress serves as a stimulus, where we get a little bit of a push and an oomph and a nudge in a direction that helps us be more productive and complete something that we couldn't do otherwise if there wasn't that external force. In our garden systems, it's no different. We want to look for that margin. We want to look for the edge between rest and stress. Okay, so I want to define 3 terms that I'm going to use for the purpose of this video, because stress is really big and nebulous. As we just talked about, stress could be something that positively motivates us. It could be something that is trauma-inducing and shuts down productivity, shuts down functioning. So for the purpose of this video, when I say stress from now on, I mean an adverse impact on a system or a species or an individual. It's something that could result in a reduction in survival or a reduction in reproduction, basically lowering the fitness. It can be chronic, and that is something that will be important to remember later on. Chronic stress is different than bursts of intermittent stress. Stimulus is a detectable change in the environment that results in some change in functional activity of our system or of species in our system. An example would be sunshine filtering in through the trees as a stimulus. The resulting change would be my pumpkin vine starting to scramble up my apple tree and reach for that sunshine. Another example is warming summer temperatures and declining rainfall causing a low-level grassland to begin to dry out, and you see hoofstock responding to that change, and that motivates them to migrate up the hillside to fresh pasture. The next word I want to define is rest. Rest is the absence of activity. It is the opportunity for an organism or a system to recover from a period of stress. Disturbance. Disturbance is a temporary change that causes a pronounced response in either the system or in an individual. It's often rapid and quick, and there is a time for rest and recovery after the disturbance. So earlier I mentioned stress and how stress can be short bursts like a disturbance, or it can be ongoing and chronic. And that's the two key differences I want to make sure we understand here. A disturbance is not chronic. It is not something that is constantly bombarding a system or an organism. There is a respite. Think of it like contractions when you're in labor. They don't go on nonstop. There is a pause and a chance to rest and reset in between. It's no different for a disturbance. A quick, intermittent, often dramatic input into the system. So what I want us to think about for our gardens is how we can use not only stimuli to help improve a system, but how we can use disturbances, those short bursts of stress, in order to get greater productivity and higher resilience out of our gardens. We're looking for that sweet spot between rest and stress when we're looking for short bursts of disturbance in order to create positive changes in our landscape, in order to increase activity and increase diversity and potentially increase yields. We need to think about the frequency. There are scheduled disturbances, for example, scheduled pruning in my garden, where I will be doing routine winter pruning every year at the same time. There is what's called stochastic disturbance. Stochastic is where it is random, unpredictable occurrences of disturbance. A great example of this, besides weather events, which obviously are stochastic disturbance, a hailstorm that I haven't been able to predict or schedule for or plan for. Another one is one that I do, which is chop and drop. Outside of my normal, regularly scheduled pruning cycle, I will randomly cut back things in the garden. If I notice something is overgrowing the path, if I notice something is encroaching on the neighbor's yard, if I'm just in a mood to add more chop and drop and I feel like a plant is overgrown, no scheduling whatsoever, I'll come back and chop and drop it. So I have my scheduled pruning and then I have my stochastic pruning. Two different things with two different effects. Then there is the third kind of disturbance, the third kind of stress that we don't want to be experiencing, and that is continuous. Our frequency needs to be scheduled or stochastic, and it needs to be dialed in so that it is not too frequent, but it definitely cannot be continuous. When we have no opportunity for rest and recovery in our system, we can stress the plants in our garden and the system as a whole to a point where it doesn't recover. And let me talk about that in just a second. So when we have a disturbance like browsing or grazing animals, which is mimicked by the gardener with pruning in the garden, it stimulates new growth of the plant. It helps it produce more of the beneficial defensive compounds that are often really good for our bodies. If we prune so much that the plant can't recover, it weakens it to the point that it will die. Prime example of this, where it's continuous stress on a system instead of short bursts of disturbance with periods of recovery, is overgrazing by goats. I don't want to in any way vilify the communities of people who use goats and overgraze systems. They often don't have any other choice, no other access to land. They often exist in parts of the world with oppressive governmental regimes and systemic inequities in their economic system where they don't have other options. But the outcome is still the same. When we utilize goats to too high of a degree, the landscape has no time to recover. The goats overgraze and destroy the landscape, resulting in death of plant matter, and it just reaches a point where it can't recover. So most of us have garden systems, be they rural or urban or suburban, where the system is under a certain amount of stress, where there is depleted soil ecology, where we've damaged the soil through better living through chemistry since the 1950s, where we have put poisons into our landscape and have thrown our systems out of balance. Because the plants have a healthy, functional, symbiotic relationship with the soil ecology and the fungal life of the soil, if we have damaged the soil, we are damaging our plants and we are weakening them. Our systems are out of balance in other ways. We have pest and disease pressures out of control, not only because we've weakened our plants and therefore they're more susceptible, think about when you are stressed out and how you're more likely to get ill, or you're less well able to withstand, the onslaught of a bully or some kind of negative pressure in your life. We've also taken the natural predators in our systems, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and we have poisoned the heck out of them, and we've destroyed their habitat. So our systems are super, super imbalanced. When we take away the predators, it allows what's called a release of the pests, and they can proliferate in a way that makes it really difficult to garden and farm. And we end up in a cyclical system of an antagonistic relationship with our gardens, an antagonistic relationship with the pests, instead of having a little bit of pest pressure, a little bit of disease pressure that exists in balance with the system. We have thrown everything all out of whack, so out of whack that none of the natural controls exist to suppress pests and diseases. Therefore, we resort to things like pesticides, herbicides, and fungicides, which not only make the cycle even worse by further eroding the resiliency of our system, they also damage our bodies. So when I talk about systems out of balance, how can we bring our system back into balance so that we don't have overwhelming pest and disease pressures, so that we bring back the natural predators, so that the system is able to take care of itself, so that we accept the reality that there will be a little bit of pest and disease issue, but it balances out without us having to resort to that antagonistic relationship? We can use disturbance as a tool to get there. And let me explain what I mean by that. So we've all got these gardens out of whack. I would call them in a state of disequilibrium, a state in which our communities and our understanding of how to interact with the soil and with the life around us is itself imbalanced, is itself out of whack. And so we have damaged the soil, we have set up cycles of pest and disease pressure that shouldn't be there, we have depleted the natural predators and their habitat. We're in a state of disequilibrium. It wasn't meant to be this way. Things are out of balance and they can't bring themselves back into balance. So one thing I think it's important to understand about disequilibrium is that it is a state of diminishing abundance. It's a state where the garden can't pull itself up by its bootstraps without help. It can't return to a state of increasing productivity without help. But the good news is, even if we have inherited states of disequilibrium, we can use the power of disturbance to bring our systems back into balance. Now, you might think the opposite of disequilibrium is equilibrium, and that therefore equilibrium is the place we want to be. I would posit that equilibrium is not so great a place either. Some of us have gardens that are in a state of equilibrium. Equilibrium is a static state. It's a state where the diversity is not increasing, it's not necessarily decreasing either. Everything's just hanging out as it is. The problem is that we can create so much more abundance than we currently have if we are not content with static equilibrium. So it may seem like a good spot, but remember how I talked at the beginning of the video that we want to find the sweet spot between rest and trauma, between rest and chronic stress. When we're in a state of total rest, a state of static equilibrium, our systems are not becoming more productive. They're not pushing toward resiliency. So where do we want to be? Where is the place we are hoping to take our gardens? It's what's called dynamic equilibrium. This is the sweet spot. Dynamic equilibrium and disturbance can help us get there. So think about a pendulum swinging. We have a system that no matter which way it gets rocked, it will settle back into the middle. So it can creatively respond to change, it can absorb and buffer change and reset itself at peak abundance. That's what we want from our system, dynamic equilibrium. So here's some examples in my garden of how I use disturbance to help increase the stability and resilience and productivity of my garden. How I use disturbance to help that pendulum swing back and forth in the hopes that someday it will settle back here in the middle of peak abundance. Getting closer, and disturbance is helping me get there. So let me show you. So a prime example of excessive disturbance that becomes a real stress on a landscape is overgrazing. Usually with goats, but it can be with lots of other creatures. So my chickens here in this part of the run always have access to this area, and very few understory plants can grow in my orchard. Now, I didn't let them have free range here until the fruit trees were mature enough to withstand them. But as you can see, they scratch and peck and remove any weeds or any sprouts of anything that come up in this part of the garden. This area is very much over foraged with chickens, but I don't have great options. They do a good job of removing pests and fallen fruit. That's all well and good, but there's not much diversity underneath my fruit trees here because I have too many poultry for this space. Now, the other parts where I'm able to rotate them in and out in a rotational paddock, there is regeneration. So here what I have is a constant source of stress, a constant source of pressure from the chickens, but in the other areas I have intermittent disturbance where the chickens and ducks get put out for short periods of time. And that means that the areas are able to recover and life is able to return, and it builds diversity. So here I am in the understory of my orchard, and I am hiding out right by my bees, so I'm going to try and be a little bit quiet. What I find here is that a regular cyclical disturbance of pruning helps my fruit trees. So I come in and I prune off these vertical growths, which are called water sprouts. This is a pear tree. On pear trees, vertical growth like that will not produce spurs. It will crowd the plant, reduce airflow, and increase the risk of fungal diseases, and won't give me a yield of fruit. So instead, what I do is I select for horizontal branches. So here I am acting as a regular force of disturbance. I am coming in, snapping off those vertical unproductive branches, which sap energy from the tree, make it too large for this space, and will never give me fruit. And I'm promoting the spur-bearing horizontal branches, which will help give me lots and lots of pears. And that kind of regular scheduled disturbance increases the fertility of my system and the productivity of my plants without stressing them out. So thanks for watching today. I hope that gives you a little inspiration that we don't want to hang out in static equilibrium. We want to push ourselves. We want to push our gardens. We want to push our communities toward dynamic equilibrium. We want to harness the power of disturbance in the garden in order to help our systems become more abundant and more resilient. That you can take examples that I mentioned in this video and think up some that work well for your location of how you can create those little bursts of change, those little bursts of stochastic or scheduled disturbance in order to build productivity and resilience. Just remember, the key for helping your system push toward recovery and adaptation and resilience is that you give the system time to rest and recover in between. It's all about restoring balance. Our focus in permaculture is on balance and how that's where we find true abundance, true resilience. So in everything, not only in the way our systems are organized and the way we push toward dynamic equilibrium, but also the frequency at which we utilize disturbance. We don't want to overdo it. It's just like a little bit of salt, on your fried eggs. You don't want to overdo it. You don't want to undersalt them. Find that sweet spot in your garden. Use the permaculture principle, observe and interact. Observe what happens after you bring in a disturbance and observe how long it takes your system to recover. And that way you can think about more efficiently using the power of disturbance so that you have a more productive, more resilient garden for the future. If you got something out of this video, please give it a thumbs up. Please check out my Patreon in the description. And if you are not interested in becoming a regular monthly contributor, if that's not for you, I also have a PayPal. You can throw a couple of bucks at it. That helps support me and my 4 kids and our permaculture journey. Thanks.